Can you imagine a moment so shocking that it changes your life forever? For thousands of German female prisoners of war, their first meal in American captivity was one such moment. A simple act, something as basic as food, became a profound turning point in their lives. It wasn't just about satisfying hunger. It wasn't just a meal. It was a gesture of humanity, of kindness, in a world where such things were hard to find. The year was 1945, and World War II had left Europe in ruins. The war had ravaged cities, families, and the very soul of nations. For those caught in the chaos, soldiers and civilians alike, life had become a fight for survival. 4 German female soldiers who found themselves taken prisoner by the Allies. It was a fate they never could have fully prepared for. They had endured months of grueling conditions, constant fear, and constant hunger. Their experiences in Nazi captivity had left them physically and emotionally battered. They had faced the horrors of war with little hope of mercy, and by the time they were captured, they had lost the sense of normalcy they once knew. But everything changed when they entered American hands. Imagine the disbelief of these women as they sat down to their first American meal. These were women who had lived through a nightmare, the brutality of the war, the loss of loved ones, and the daily terror of being on the wrong side of history. After the constant deprivation and hardship of their past, could food really hold such power? Could a simple meal change everything? It wasn't just the physical nourishment that struck them. It was the emotional shock that accompanied it. For the first time in years, these women found themselves offered something that wasn't a punishment, something that wasn't scarce, something that didn't come with the fear of retribution. It was warmth. It was sustenance. It was care. What made this meal so extraordinary? What was it about this moment that left such an indelible mark on the hearts and minds of these women? It wasn't just the food itself. It was the act behind it. It was the human connection, the first sign of kindness after years of suffering. These women, who had once believed they had lost all hope, suddenly saw that humanity still existed, even in the most unlikely of places. But how did they react? How did they process this moment of unexpected kindness? As the war began to wind down in 1945, a sense of dread and uncertainty swept over Europe. The devastation was so widespread that it felt as though no one would emerge unscathed. Amidst the chaos, millions of soldiers found themselves prisoners, not just of war, but of their own circumstances. Among those caught in the web of captivity were the German female soldiers, who had fought for the Reich, often with little understanding of the greater causes they were fighting for. Now, in the aftermath of a brutal conflict, many of them faced their own battles, the ones that would begin the moment they crossed the threshold of Allied captivity. The American soldiers who stood at the front lines were trained for combat, but they had never quite prepared for the profound emotional and psychological impact of war's human toll. Many of them were aware of the suffering inflicted by the Nazis, but they had no experience dealing with soldiers who had been on the opposite side, especially the women who had been enlisted in the German army. These women had their own stories of survival, and it was the first meal they were offered in American custody that would serve as a point of transformation, not just for them, but also for their captors. When the German women found themselves captured by the Allies, it wasn't just the reality of being a prisoner that weighed heavily on their minds. It was also the trauma they had experienced as soldiers and the terrifying uncertainty of what would happen next. The brutal conditions of wartime Germany had pushed the women to the brink of exhaustion, both physically and emotionally. Some had been serving as auxiliary soldiers in support roles, administrative, medical, and logistical, but many had also been thrown into the heat of battle, forced to stand side by side with men in the most dangerous of circumstances. Regardless of their role, all were subjected to the horrors of war. To imagine the hunger these women experienced is to understand how basic human needs become magnified under extreme conditions. For years, they had lived with constant shortages of food, water, and proper clothing. The war had drained resources, and what was once a nation of promise and prosperity had collapsed into a society of rationing and deprivation. The idea of a decent meal, A full plate of nourishing food was a distant memory. It had been so long since they had eaten something that wasn't stale, cold, or scrounged from the battlefield. To think that something as simple as bread, a cup of soup, or fresh fruit could be so unfamiliar, so strange, was hard to grasp for anyone who had never endured such privation. So, when the American soldiers served them their first meal, it wasn't just food that was being offered. It was the first real glimpse of compassion they had encountered in years. The food was simple, probably nothing extravagant, yet the act of receiving it in a relatively warm setting with no strings attached was something that had never crossed their minds as possible. The irony of the situation struck these women immediately. In a time when food was scarce and their bodies had grown accustomed to deprivation, the very notion of a simple meal seemed almost like a luxury. The Americans, who were considered the enemy only days before, now offered them something far more valuable than just a plate of food. They offered a fleeting sense of normalcy, an invitation to heal. But what was it about this meal that left such a lasting impression? What made it so different from the meals they had grown accustomed to in their own army? The stark contrast lies not only in the quality of the food, but in the power of the moment. The Americans didn't just give them food, they gave them dignity. In the eyes of the German female POWs, their status as captives could easily have meant their existence was reduced to something less than human. They were the enemy. They had fought for a nation that was now on the losing side of history. But in that simple act of offering food, the Americans gave them a measure of respect. They treated them not as enemies, but as human beings. Food has always been more than just sustenance. For centuries, it has symbolized culture, community, and survival. And in this particular moment, for these women, food became something much deeper. It was a sign of the Allies' willingness to offer something beyond the usual punishment for the vanquished. The German soldiers who fought fiercely for their homeland were now reduced to helpless prisoners. And yet, in the face of this overwhelming power dynamic, the Americans extended the hand of peace and mercy through something as simple as a meal. The act itself was symbolic. It was an invitation to a new reality, one where these women were no longer the enemy to be destroyed, but were individuals with their own stories, their own humanity. The meal may have been modest, but it was the kindness behind it that mattered most. It was something the women had not expected in this brutal war, where they had been taught to see their enemies as monsters. And yet, this act of generosity shattered that perception, leaving them with a deep sense of bewilderment. It wasn't just a meal. It was a lifeline, a moment of clarity in a world that had gone mad. The German women, who had been taught to trust no one, now had to process the fact that their new reality might not be as bleak as they had anticipated. It wasn't just the food that mattered, but the human touch, the warmth of the American soldiers offering them something that said, "You are not just an enemy. You are not just a casualty of war. You are human." As the women sat at the table, spooning the soup, breaking off pieces of bread, and eating the fruits they had not tasted in years, it must have felt like a surreal experience. The war had torn so much apart, homes, families, friendships, and had driven the world into a relentless cycle of hatred and suffering. But this moment, this simple meal, was the first sign that there could be something beyond war. There could be peace, there could be understanding, and there could be healing. The meal was a paradox in itself. On one hand, it was a reminder of all the suffering they had endured, all the cruelty they had been subjected to. But on the other hand, it was a glimpse of what could be a chance to rebuild, to trust again, to restore their faith in humanity. For those few moments, they were no longer soldiers or enemies. They were women sitting down to share in something that every human being needs: food, compassion, and kindness. As the women continued to eat, it's likely they didn't just consume the food in front of them. They were taking in more than just bread and soup. They were consuming the idea that this new life, this new experience might be different. That change was possible. They weren't trapped in the world of war anymore. They had been given a taste of something better, something worth living for, something that would allow them to carry on through the days ahead. And though the American soldiers didn't know at the time, they had unwittingly offered these women more than just a meal. They had given them a chance at redemption, a second chance at life. The implications of this simple meal went far beyond the immediate satisfaction of hunger. It was the start of a new chapter, one where these women could begin to imagine a future beyond the battlefield. They could begin to heal, to hope, and maybe, just maybe, to forgive. And that, more than any other victory in the war, was what truly changed everything for these women. As they finished their meal and began to process the full weight of what had just transpired, these women were faced with something even more shocking than the meal itself: the possibility of peace, of life after war. It was something they had never imagined in their darkest moments, yet here it was, right before them, offered by the very people they had once called their enemies. And it was all because of a simple act of kindness, food. For these women, who had spent months or even years entrenched in war's brutal realities, this unexpected act of kindness was more than just an interruption to their suffering. It was the moment when their perception of the enemy began to fracture. An enemy that had been defined by hatred and violence now presented them with a form of humanity that many of them had long thought lost. But in that moment, they were no longer prisoners of war. They were women who had been served a meal with dignity, and that small act carried more weight than any war-related propaganda ever could. Food, when it arrived, was more than a physical necessity. It was a symbol of something larger, something intangible. It represented hope. It represented a connection that these women had long been deprived of. It's difficult for many to understand just how profound an impact something as basic as a meal could have. After all, food is often taken for granted in times of peace. But in times of war, when deprivation becomes a daily reality, food is far more than sustenance. It's survival. It's life itself. And in a time when even the basic act of eating could feel like an extraordinary privilege, this meal became a new beginning. What's often overlooked in the story of war is the psychological impact food, or the lack of it, can have on a person. For these women, each meal during the war had been scarce, barely enough to sustain them, often consisting of the bare minimum to keep them from starving. The image of their once promising homeland, reduced to a ravaged shell of its former self, was reflected in the meals they received. It was more than just the hunger they endured. It was the loss of human dignity. Hunger became a daily reminder of their status. They were at the mercy of others, often receiving whatever scraps could be spared. And then came this meal from the Americans. The food, though modest, was not just nourishment. It was an act of kindness wrapped in the form of something they had long been denied. The Germans had been conditioned, especially the soldiers, to think of their captors as enemies, people who were simply a part of the opposing side. However, this simple act of offering food was radically different. These women had fought fiercely for their country, perhaps even thinking of themselves as part of a larger effort, doing what they believed was right. The concept of their captors, especially the Americans, offering them not just a meal, but one filled with generosity and human warmth, had to be both surreal and jarring. One of the critical psychological effects of captivity is the erosion of personal identity. Prisoners of war are stripped of their roles, their titles, and their agency. They are often reduced to mere numbers, sometimes subjected to degrading treatment simply because they are seen as enemy combatants. Many of these German women must have entered captivity with no real sense of what their future would look like, beyond the sheer survival instinct that drove them each day. In the face of this uncertainty, they were offered a chance to rediscover their humanity, not just as soldiers or prisoners, but as individuals deserving of compassion. For the women who had endured such hardship, a simple meal was a powerful statement. It told them they had not been forgotten. Even though they had once been seen as the enemy, there was now a recognition of their individual suffering. The Americans were not just delivering a meal. They were signaling that these women were worthy of kindness, that they were more than just the uniform they had worn. In war, there are countless acts of cruelty and violence. But there are also acts of mercy that transcend the bitterness of conflict. This meal was one such act. The shock the women felt wasn't just because of the food itself. It was because they had never imagined that those they considered their enemies could show such compassion. This marked a defining moment, a shift in perception. These women, who had been raised to believe that the enemy was devoid of empathy, were now faced with the reality that their enemies were, in fact, human beings capable of kindness. As the women ate, they began to feel the stirrings of something they had long thought absent: trust. Could it be possible that their captors could have a role to play in their healing? Could they, the women who had been victims of the war in so many ways, begin to feel that humanity still had the capacity to recover from the darkness of the battlefield? The emotional complexities of this moment cannot be overstated. The German female soldiers were living embodiments of a war-torn world. They had borne witness to the collapse of an empire, the deaths of their comrades, the destruction of their homes, and the loss of their loved ones. They had been part of an ideology that, for many of them, had made them complicit in the suffering of others. And now, sitting down to this meal, they were experiencing an emotional jolt that shook them to their very core. It was a challenge to everything they had ever known, everything they had been taught to believe. Imagine the confusion they must have felt as they chewed their food, their minds wrestling with the implications of what they were experiencing. The Americans, those they had been taught to fear and hate, had given them something no one else had for years: care. It wasn't just food, it was recognition of their dignity as human beings. For women who had been stripped of everything, this moment, this meal, was a painful but necessary step toward regaining something they thought was lost: hope. For some of these women, the emotional response was probably overwhelming. To be fed was to be seen again as a person, not a casualty of war. It was to reawaken to the simple pleasures of life: a full belly, the warmth of a meal, and the sensation of no longer fighting for survival in the immediate moment. This was a gift, and it was given without expectation of anything in return. The meal also brought with it a sense of bewilderment. For so long, these women had been told that the war was justified, that they were fighting for a cause. Now, in the presence of the enemy, they were confronted with a reality they had never been prepared for: mercy. It was as if a door had opened for them to imagine a world beyond the one they had been taught to fight for. Could it be possible that the world was not as black and white as they had believed? Could the hatred that had fueled the war have been misguided all along? This was a pivotal moment for the women. It was a moment of reckoning. Could they reconcile the horrors they had witnessed with this new experience of kindness? Could they leave behind the image of the Americans as brutal foes and begin to see them as human beings capable of empathy? It wasn't an easy transition, nor should it be expected that all of them instantly embraced this shift. But for many, the first meal offered by the Americans was the beginning of a profound emotional journey. By offering food, the Americans were offering something more: a chance to rebuild, a chance to restore the broken parts of their identities, a chance to heal. The first meal, while a simple act, was in many ways an invitation to reimagine their future, a future where they were no longer defined by their roles as soldiers, but by their roles as individuals with the capacity for survival, kindness, and forgiveness. As the women sat there eating, perhaps they realized something. Their journey, as long and difficult as it had been, wasn't over. There was still more to come, and it was through acts of mercy like this that they could begin to find peace. It was through moments like this meal that they could begin to heal from the deep scars the war had left on their bodies and souls. This meal was an opportunity to break free from the darkness. It was a chance to reclaim what the war had tried to steal from them: dignity, compassion, and hope. And though it may seem like a small thing, that meal was a defining moment in their experience as prisoners. It was a turning point, not just in their captivity, but in the story of who they were and who they could become after the war. As they finished eating and processed the overwhelming emotions of the day, they began to look ahead, not just at their uncertain futures as prisoners, but at the possibility of finding peace within themselves. And it all started with that first meal, the meal that proved to them that even in the most desperate of times, there was still the potential for kindness, redemption, and change. As the days went by after their first American meal, something began to shift in the minds of these German female prisoners of war. The warmth they felt from that unexpected kindness lingered long after the meal itself had ended. It wasn't just about the sustenance, it was about the emotional and psychological impact of that meal. In that moment, they had been given something far more profound than food. They had been given a reminder that, despite the horrors they had witnessed and the brutalization they had endured, there was still a glimmer of humanity left in the world. In the aftermath of the war, as these women processed their experiences and began to reintegrate into a post-war Europe, the effects of that first American meal would resonate with them in unexpected ways. For many, it was a moment that marked the beginning of healing, not just from the physical wounds inflicted by the war, but from the deeper, psychological scars that would linger long after the war had ended. The meal had been a form of reconciliation, not just with their captors, but with themselves. It forced these women to confront the cognitive dissonance they had lived with throughout the war. How could they reconcile the Nazi ideology that they had been taught with the kindness shown to them by the enemy? For those who had once been staunch believers in the German cause, this simple meal was an emotional and moral awakening. It challenged everything they had been taught about the enemy, and, in doing so, gave them the space to reconsider their own beliefs and actions. In the months following their capture, many of these women found themselves in limbo, caught between the brutal legacy of war and the uncertain future that awaited them. The emotional impact of their captivity was profound. The war had stripped them of everything: identity, purpose, and belonging. Now, as prisoners, they were forced to confront their own vulnerability and powerlessness. Yet, the act of receiving that meal from their captors also offered them the opportunity to redefine themselves. They were no longer just victims of war. They were survivors. They were women who had witnessed the worst of humanity, and yet, in the midst of that darkness, they had been given a glimpse of light. But the healing process was not simple. It was complicated by the fact that these women were not just victims of war. They were also perpetrators. Many of them had been soldiers, and some had even been complicit in the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. This created a deep sense of guilt, a feeling that they were unworthy of the kindness extended to them by their captors. How could they accept a meal from the very people they had once fought against, knowing the pain they had caused during the war? This sense of guilt was compounded by the fact that the war had forced them into a position where survival was the only thing that mattered. The choices they made, the actions they took, were often driven by the need to stay alive in an unforgiving world. They had been soldiers, yes, but they were also human beings caught in a tragic and complex situation. Many of these women had seen the horrors of war up close, and the guilt they carried was not just about the things they had done, but about the things they had witnessed and the lives that had been lost. Yet, despite this internal struggle, the meal remained a powerful symbol of the possibility of redemption. It was a reminder that even in the darkest moments of war, there was still room for mercy. It was a moment that allowed these women to begin to process their experiences, to reflect on the choices they had made, and to consider what kind of people they wanted to become once the war was over. The psychological impact of that meal was far-reaching. For many of these women, the experience became a cornerstone of their post-war identity. It was a reminder that the war had not entirely stripped them of their humanity, that there was still something worth holding on to, something worth fighting for, even after everything had fallen apart. The kindness of the American soldiers had shown them that forgiveness, both from others and from themselves, was possible. It was a lesson that would stay with them long after the war had ended. For some, the impact of this meal extended far beyond the immediate aftermath of their captivity. It became a defining moment in their lives, one they would reflect on for years to come. It was a lesson in empathy, in the power of human connection, in the possibility of redemption. And as these women tried to reintegrate into a society that had been shattered by war, the memory of that meal served as a guiding light, a reminder that even in the most unimaginable circumstances, there was still the potential for healing, for growth, and for change. In the years that followed, Many of these women found themselves grappling with the complexities of reintegration into post-war Germany. The wounds of the past were not easily healed, and the process of coming to terms with their role in the war was often painful and difficult. But in the midst of this struggle, the memory of their first American meal remained a powerful force. It became a touchstone, a reminder that even the most brutal and devastating of experiences could be transformed by acts of kindness and mercy. The German female POWs had been through the unimaginable. They had been caught in the madness of a war that consumed everything in its path, leaving destruction, death, and despair in its wake. But in that one moment, that single act of kindness, they had been shown something that transcended the war, something that was not defined by flags, uniforms, or ideologies. They had been shown humanity. This realization, that there was more to life than the war, that there was more to being human than simply being a soldier, was not an easy one to accept. But over time, it became a foundation upon which many of these women were able to rebuild their lives. It gave them the strength to face the challenges of post-war existence, to confront their own guilt and shame, and to begin the process of healing. For some of them, this meal represented the beginning of a long journey toward forgiveness, not just of others, but of themselves. It was a journey that would take years, even decades, to fully navigate. But it was a journey they had never expected to take. They had gone from being the enemy to being the recipients of mercy, and that shift changed them in ways they had never anticipated. The power of that transformation cannot be overstated. It was a quiet revolution, a shift in the way they saw themselves and the world around them. In the years after the war, as they rebuilt their lives and their communities, these women would carry with them the memory of that first meal, the moment when they had been shown that even in the worst of circumstances, there was still the possibility of redemption. And though the scars of the war would never fully disappear, the lesson they had learned from that meal remained a guiding principle in their lives. It was a reminder that no matter how far they had fallen, no matter how broken they had become, there was still the possibility of healing. There was still the possibility of hope. And for those who had the chance to share their stories, the memory of that meal became a symbol of the unexpected acts of mercy that shaped their lives. It was a story of survival, yes, but also one of resilience. A story of how, in the darkest of times, humanity could still shine through. It was a story that transcended war, that spoke to the heart of what it means to be human. As these women lived out the rest of their lives, they carried with them the knowledge that their first American meal was not just a moment of survival. It was a moment of rebirth. It was the start of a new chapter in their lives, one that was defined not by war, but by the possibility of a future filled with kindness, understanding, and, perhaps most importantly, the ability to forgive.